July 22nd, 1944, 6 hours and 43 minutes in the afternoon, approximately 14 nautical miles north of the coast of Guam, Pacific Ocean. Commander Marcus Theodore Whitfield, 58, gripped the bridge railing of the USS Pawnee with hands that had held commercial fishing ropes in the North Atlantic for 32 years before the war, his blue eyes faded by salt and decades of sea sun now fixed on the horizon where black smoke still rose from Asan Beach. His gray hair, cut unevenly because he trimmed it himself with kitchen scissors, was soaked with sweat beneath the battered merchant marine cap that he refused to exchange for an officer's. Whitfield was not an Annapolis graduate, had not studied naval tactics at military academies, had never commanded a warship until 18 months ago. He was a cod fisherman from Gloucester, Massachusetts, who had spent 3 decades sailing some of the world's most treacherous seas and that many naval officers would consider bathtubs with engines. His appointment as commander of the Pawnee, a Navajo-class salvage tug, converted for amphibious operations, had been met with quiet skepticism by younger, formally trained officers. Now, with the sun beginning to set over the Pacific and the distant but unmistakable sound of 900 American soldiers screaming for rescue echoing across the water, Whitfield faced a decision that no Naval Academy manual, no established doctrine, no combat protocol could adequately resolve. Through his captured German binoculars, he could see the men on the beach, some still in uniform, some shirtless, waving frantically, some even entering the water as if they could swim the miles from the ship. His executive officer, Lieutenant Jonathan Drabes, 29, Annapolis, graduate class of 1937, stood at his side with an expression that mixed anguish and rigid military professionalism. From the ship's radio came clear orders, issued 40 minutes earlier by Admiral Richmond Kelly Turner, commander of the amphibious forces. All non-essential ships were to withdraw immediately from the combat zone because Japanese coastal artillery had sunk 3 landing craft in the previous 2 hours, and the risk of losing more ships was unacceptable. The Pawnee, technically classified as non-essential for main assault operations now that the first wave of Marines was ashore, was supposed to leave 30 minutes ago. But Whitfield, who had spent decades making life-and-death decisions in North Atlantic storms, where hesitation meant losing an entire crew, wouldn't budge. He knew something that Academy officers couldn't learn from simulations or books. Sometimes rules are there to be broken, and sometimes a man must rely on instincts developed not in classrooms, but in years of brutal reality at sea. To the south, distant but approaching, Whitfield could make out the outlines of 4 Japanese Otore-class patrol ships moving along the coast, hunting exactly the kind of isolated target that the Pawnee represented. His ship could make 38 knots in ideal conditions, a speed he had coaxed from the engine through unauthorized modifications that would make official naval engineers half-heart attacks, but that any fishing boat mechanic would recognize as maritime common sense. The Japanese, if he had correctly calculated their speeds, observed in recent intelligence reports, could make at most 33 knots. A margin of 5 knots wasn't much, especially if the Japanese had air support or achieved better tactical positioning. But it was enough for a fisherman who had spent decades navigating even narrower margins between success and disaster. 7 months earlier, in Berlin Kapit N.A. Sursee Otto Bringmann 44 years old, a Kriegsmarine naval tactics specialist with 18 years of formal military service and education at the best German naval academies, was reading with scholarly interest but growing disdain an intelligence report on the United States Navy provided by its Japanese allies. The document, translated from Japanese through multiple intermediaries, and therefore likely distorted, described the American naval expansion program in details that Brinkman found simultaneously impressive in scale but ridiculous in execution. He called his deputy, Korvetin Kapit N.A. Hans Müller, 36 years old, also a graduate of the Flensburg Naval Academy with 11 years of service, and read aloud some particularly absurd passages, while O drank strong coffee in porcelain mugs, with the emblem of the Kriegsmarine. The report indicated that the American Navy was commissioning men aged 50, 60, even 65 as commanders of support ships, tugs, and auxiliary vessels. Many of these commanders came from the merchant marine or even the civilian fishing industry, with no formal naval training beyond short courses lasting a few weeks. Brinkman slammed the report down on the polished mahogany desk with a laugh that echoed through the offices. Oak-paneled walls decorated with paintings of historic naval battles. Mullah, always the perfect subordinate, smiled in response but waited for his superior's comment. Brinkman did not disappoint. He stood up, walked over to the map of the Pacific posted on the wall, and began to lecture as if he were in a classroom. The Americans, he explained, were making the classic mistake of desperate empires, diluting military excellence with civilian amateurism. The Japanese had all naval commanders trained from adolescence at rigorous academies, like where training began at age 15 or 16 and continued for at least 4 years of relentless discipline. Even captains of small Japanese patrol craft had at least 12 years of continuous naval service, and Americans were putting elderly fishermen in command of warships. Brinkman cited from memory the statistics he knew about commander training in the Kriegsmarine. The average age of support vessel commanders was 34, all with a minimum of 8 years of active naval service, all graduates from officer programs that took a minimum of 3 years to complete. The report described Commander Whitfield of the Pawnee, 58 years old, commercial fisherman turned naval officer after a 6-week course, promoted to commander after just 14 months of service because he apparently had experience sailing in bad weather. Brinkman almost choked with laughter. Mullah tried to be the voice of reason, suggesting that perhaps civilian maritime experience might have some value, but Brinkman silenced him with an impatient gesture. Experience fishing for cod from trawlers, he argued, had no relation to naval command in a combat zone. Modern warfare required understanding complex tactics, coordinating multiple weapons systems, communicating under extreme pressure, making decisions based on years of specific military training. A fisherman might know how to cast nets and avoid storms, but he would certainly panic when faced with enemy artillery, air raids, or complex tactical maneuvers. The Americans, Brinkman concluded with absolute confidence backed by decades of established military doctrine, were essentially handing over their ships to incompetent commanders who would make basic mistakes under fire. He predicted that the loss rate of American ships commanded by these civilian amateurs would be at least 50% higher than ships commanded by properly trained officers. It was simple, military mathematics, he said, based on centuries of naval history. You didn't put amateurs in command of warships, no matter how desperate you were for commanders. The Japanese, Brinkman assured Mueller, would take advantage of this American weakness without mercy. Every time one of these elderly and inexperienced commanders made a decision under the pressure of real combat, he would make the fatal mistake that properly trained officers would know how to avoid. Mueller carefully filed the report, but not before Brinkman had underlined Whitfield's name in red pen and written in the margin. Perfect example of American amateurism that will result in unnecessary losses. The Pawnee had arrived in Guam waters 3 days earlier as part of the support fleet for Operation Forager, the American invasion of the Mariana Islands, designed to cut Japanese lines of communication across the Central Pacific and provide bases for B-29 bombers to reach mainland Japan. The invasion of Guam, American territory captured by the Japanese, in December 19, involved more than 50,000 soldiers and Marines, hundreds of ships, and the largest concentration of American naval power gathered up to that time in the Pacific. The Pawnee, with its modest 82-meter length and crew of 120 men, was an insignificant drop in this ocean of military power, assigned to towing and salvage missions that planners considered secondary. But Whitfield, with his crew mostly made up of merchant marine reservists, with an average age of 40, had made his little ship surprisingly effective through improvisations that younger officers would have considered them non-regulatory, but which men with decades of practical maritime experience recognized as obviously correct. He had redistributed weight on the ship to improve speed, modified the engine's cooling system to allow operation beyond official specifications for short periods, and trained his crew in rapid response techniques he had developed while towing trawlers in distress in the North Atlantic, where you had minutes, not hours, to save lives. In the 3 days since arrival, the Pawnee had towed 7 damaged landing craft out of the danger zone, rescued 234 men from 2 transport ships that ran aground on uncharted coral reefs, and even provided anti-aircraft fire support against 3 waves of Japanese planes using old 20mm cannons that the crew had modified for better range. Whitfield's reputation among the Marines had grown quickly. The old fisherman who showed up when needed, who broke rules to save lives, who never hesitated when other commanders consulted manuals. But now, at 6:57 on the afternoon of July 22nd, Whitfield faced not a routine rescue, but a mathematical impossibility. 900 men on the beach under intensifying Japanese fire, coastal artillery that had sunk 3 ships in the last few hours, for enemy patrol ships approaching, direct orders to withdraw, and a ship that, Untold fast, was neither sufficiently armored nor armed for direct combat. Any Annapolis-trained officer would know the answer. You obey orders, withdraw, and trust that the 900 souls on the beach will be rescued by more appropriate forces when the tactical situation improves. It was the militarily correct decision, the only one that protocols and regulations allowed. But Whitfield wasn't from and he knew something academies didn't teach. Sometimes there are no more appropriate forces coming. Sometimes you're all those 900 souls have, and sometimes the militarily correct decision is the morally unforgivable decision. Whitfield turned to Reeves, his executive officer, who had undisguised tears in his eyes as he looked at the beach through his own binoculars. Reeves was a good officer, perfectly trained, who would follow orders to the death. But Whitfield could see that the young man was being torn apart inside by the contradiction between what his academy had taught him and what his heart screamed. Whitfield placed a calloused hand on the young lieutenant's shoulder and said in a calm voice that carried 3 decades of authority gained at sea, "I'm going to give you a direct order now, and you're going to record it in the logbook exactly as I say, because when this is over, I want it to be absolutely clear that the responsibility is mine alone." Reeves stared at him, confusion mixed with hope on his young face. Whitfield continued, "Let's get these 900 men, all of them. We're going to go straight to that beach, get as many on board as we can, and then we're going to run at 38 knots out of there before the Japanese realize what's happened. You're going to tell me this is crazy, that I'm violating direct orders, that I'm going to be..." "You are correct in all of these things, but I can't live with myself if I let 900 Americans die on the beach because the manual said I should back off." Reeves opened his mouth to protest, to cite regulations, but Whitfield gently interrupted him. "I know what Annapolis taught you, son, but Annapolis doesn't teach you about the one time I lost 2 of my crew in a storm because I hesitated, because I followed the recommended procedure instead of trusting my instinct, because I let the manual decide instead of deciding myself. I saw them drown while I consulted charts. I heard her final screams as I recalculated. That was 23 years ago, and I still wake up thinking about them every night. I'm not going to carry 900 ghosts for the rest of my life because I was afraid of breaking rules." Reeves nodded slowly, tears now openly streaming down his face, and walked to the logbook to record what would inevitably be Whitfield's career-ending order. The Pawnee's crew, when informed of Whitfield's plan via the ship's internal communications system, responded not with the fear that younger officers might have expected, but with immediate determination and efficient preparation that reflected their own origin within the merchant marine and civilian maritime industries. Chief Engineer Robert McCarthy, 54, who had spent 28 years keeping fishing boat diesel engines running in harsh conditions, Cybele, he immediately began preparing the engine for maximum emergency operation, a process he had refined over decades, but which no official naval manual described because no naval manual expected you to deliberately abuse your engine in this way. Bosun Thomas Sullivan, 61, a 40-year veteran of the merchant marine who had loaded and unloaded thousands of tons of cargo in conditions ranging from dead calm to hurricanes, began organizing the crew into rescue teams with the quiet efficiency of someone who had done similar work hundreds of times, though never under enemy fire. Gunner Charles Henderson, a former professional hunter from Wyoming who had enlisted at 46 because, as he explained to his skeptical recruiter, he could shoot better than any 20-year-old and the Navy needed marksmen, not athletes, positioned his 20mm anti-aircraft guns at angles that would maximize coverage if Japanese coastal artillery attempted to hit the ship as it approached the beach. Each man knew they were about to directly violate an admiral's orders, risk their lives in ways that dramatically exceeded any reasonable description of duty, and possibly bring about the end of their own naval careers if they survived. None of them hesitated for a second. These were men who had spent decades braving oceans, storms, and treacherous seas, who didn't care about regulations or hierarchies. And to them the choice was obvious. You don't let 900 Americans die when you can save them, no matter what the manuals say. At 7 o'clock, 9 minutes in the afternoon, Whitfield gave the order, and the Pawnee turned straight for Asan Beach, accelerating to full speed, while McCarthy in the engine compartment pushed the engine beyond any official specifications. The approach would take approximately 12 minutes at full speed, during which time the ship would be completely vulnerable to coastal artillery fire that the Japanese would certainly direct at such a tempting target. Through binoculars, Whitfield could see the men on the beach, realizing what was happening. At first, confused, then elated, waving with renewed frenzy, some dropping to their knees in anticipated gratitude. But he could also see, with terrifying clarity, the Japanese artillery positions in the hills behind the beach adjusting their cannons to track the approaching ship. 5 minutes into the approach, the first Japanese artillery salvo fell 200 meters in front of the Pawnee, creating 50-foot columns of water that the ship crossed seconds later, covering the deck with salt spray. Whitfield didn't swerve, didn't slow down, maintaining a straight course for the beach while mentally calculating angles, speeds, and trajectories with the same intuition he had used for decades to navigate through ice fields in the North Atlantic. The second salvo landed 150 meters behind them, which told Whitfield that the Japanese gunners were having difficulty calculating the Pawnee's speed because no ship of her size should be moving that fast. It was a small advantage, but Whitfield had built an entire career on accumulated small advantages. The third salvo landed close enough that shrapnel hit the ship's hull with metallic sounds that made the crew on deck instinctively duck, but no critical damage was done. Whitfield shouted at Henderson to maintain constant anti-aircraft fire, not to actually hit the artillery positions, which were very well protected and beyond the effective range of the Pawnee's light guns, but to create smoke and confusion that could degrade the enemy's aim for another few precious seconds. It was the kind of tactic he had learned, not at the Naval Academy, but from decades of observing how smoke from steamship furnaces affected visibility in different wind and light conditions, practical knowledge that no textbook could adequately teach. 7 minutes into the approach, Reeves reported that the 4 Japanese patrol ships had definitely detected the Pawnee and were altering course for interception, but were still far enough away that Whitfield estimated he had perhaps 20 minutes before they would pose a serious threat if he could maintain full speed after boarding. It was tight but manageable time, exactly the kind of narrow margin that fishermen spent their entire careers navigating. The 4th Japanese artillery salvo hit the water just 50 meters to the Pawnee's port side, close enough that the underwater explosion created a shock wave that shook the entire ship and shattered to bridge windows. Whitfield could feel to take through his feet the vibrations of the engine working beyond its limits, a slightly irregular rhythm that any naval engineer would say was a precursor to catastrophic failure, but that McCarthy, through decades of experience, knew to be on the thin line between maximum power and self-destruction, a line he could maintain for exactly as long as they needed, but not a minute longer. At 9 minutes, the Pawnee was close enough to the beach that Whitfield could see the individual faces of the 900 men, many too young to have full beards, some clearly injured, others helping shipmates to their feet in the shallow water, all looking at the approaching ship as if it were a divine apparition. Sullivan already had rescue teams positioned on deck with ropes, ladders, and improvised nets made from whatever materials were available, prepared with an efficiency that reflected 40 years of experience in fast-loading operations in difficult conditions. At 7:21 minutes, the Pawnee reached the beach. Whitfield, executing an approach maneuver that he had used thousands of times when docking in small New England ports in rough seas, but that no official naval manual would describe as appropriate for a combat zone. He turned the ship parallel to the beach, less than 50 yards offshore, essentially offering the entire length of the ship as a boarding platform, while keeping engines in readiness for instantaneous acceleration. It was a maneuver that would leave the ship completely vulnerable for several crucial minutes, but it was also the only way to board 900 men in a reasonable time. Sullivan and his teams began pulling men aboard with astonishing speed, using techniques developed from decades of civilian cargo work adapted instantly for military rescue. The strongest climbed first, and then helped pull the wounded, creating human chains that transferred men from the water to the deck with an efficiency reminiscent of industrial production lines. Whitfield kept his eyes fixed simultaneously on 3 threats: the coastal artillery that was now stationary and rapidly adjusting, the Japanese patrol ships that were approaching at 33 knots and would be in gun range in 15 minutes, and the mental clock he kept counting every second they remained stationary. The 5th artillery salvo fell 20 meters to the starboard side, creating a column of water that fell on the deck and on the men being rescued, but no one stopped working. The 6th salvo hit the beach just 10 meters from the ship, kicking up sand and shrapnel that hit the hull with enough force to pierce thin sheet metal in 2 places, but still nothing critical for buoyancy. Whitfield began to mentally calculate when they would have to leave, balancing against how many men they could board per minute versus how much time they had before they became a stationary target for artillery that had found the correct range. It was brutal mathematics that reduced human lives to equations of time and probability, exactly the kind of calculations fishermen made when deciding how long they could remained in a dangerous area before a storm arrived. 4 minutes into the boarding operation, Sullivan reported 520 men on board, which meant they were taking men out of the water at approximately 130 per minute, an extraordinary pace but still not fast enough to board all 900 before the patrol ships came within lethal range. Whitfield made the calculation instantly. At this rate, they would need another 3 minutes to board them all. But the Japanese ships would be in effective gun range in approximately 8 minutes, which meant they would have perhaps 5 minutes of margin if they could maintain the boarding pace, and if the Japanese did not accelerate beyond their estimated speeds. It was an acceptable margin by fishing standards in the North Atlantic, where you often had to gamble that you could process the catch before the weather changed. But it was a terrifying margin by military standards, where commanders were trained to maintain substantial safety buffers. The 7th artillery salvo hit directly on the beach, where men had been standing just minutes before, raising an explosion that would have killed dozens if the Pawnee had not arrived when it did. Whitfield realized with terrifying clarity that if he had obeyed orders and retreated he would now be 12 miles away, hearing on the radio about 900. Americans being slaughtered by artillery that they could not prevent, and that no other ships would be positioned to rescue. Validation did not bring satisfaction, only redoubled determination to complete what had been started. 6 minutes into boarding, Sullivan reported 730 on board, a pace maintained despite now boarding mainly wounded who needed to be physically carried. The crew was moving with mechanical efficiency, born of exhaustion and adrenaline, each man performing his role without the need for orders, because Sullivan had created a system that worked through distributive competence, not centralized command, just as civilian cargo crews had functioned in commercial ports for generations. At 7:28 minutes, with 893 men on board and only 7 still in the water being pulled toward the ship, Whitfield saw through binoculars the leader of the Japanese patrol ships open fire at maximum range, shells falling 500 yards short but closing quickly. He had perhaps 2 minutes before Japanese fire became accurate enough to begin hitting the Pawnee, and he still had 7 men in the water, plus the whole process of making sure everyone was safely on deck before he could accelerate to a high-speed escape. It was a margin so narrow it defied probability. But Whitfield had spent his entire career operating on impossible margins and surviving on decades of expertise. The 8th salvo of coastal artillery finally hit the Pawnee directly, striking the stern and destroying the small lifeboat mounted there, but luckily avoiding the rudder and propellers, which were critical vulnerabilities. Shrapnel swept across the aft deck, injuring 3 crew members and 2 of the newly rescued men. But no injuries were immediately fatal, and the ship remained fully operational. Sullivan shouted that the last man was on board, information that Whitfield processed instantly, along with the observation that Japanese shells from the patrol ships now fell only 200 meters short, and that they had perhaps a minute before their range became lethal. He shouted at McCarthy to give him all the engine he had ordered, Henderson to concentrate anti-aircraft fire toward the patrol ships to force them to maneuver, even though they had no real chance of a hit at that range, and turned the Pawnee straight into the open sea, while accelerating to 38 knots, a speed that made the entire ship vibrate worryingly, but which immediately began to clear the Japanese pursuers. The escape was a 43-minute chase through increasingly dark waters as the sun completely set, turning the ocean into a black surface dotted with flashes of Japanese artillery that fell farther and farther away as the Pawnee's superior speed created distance that the Japanese could not close. Whitfield sailed not in a straight line, which would have been standard naval doctrine to maximize escape speed, but in a series of random zigzags that he had developed decades ago to avoid floating ice in the dark. A pattern that made it impossible for Japanese gunners to predict where the ship would be when its shells arrived. It was improvisation based on completely unrelated experience that no academy-trained officer would have thought to use because it wasn't in any evasion tactics manual. But it worked because principles of avoiding unpredictable objects in the dark were universal, regardless of whether the objects were icebergs or artillery shells. McCarthy kept the engine beyond red limits for 38 minutes, during which time he later said he was certain the engine would explode at any second, but his intimate understanding of each component based on 28 years of experience told him the engine would last exactly 39 minutes in these conditions before catastrophic failure. And at 38 minutes, Whitfield called him in, saying they could slow down to normal speed because they had escaped. At 39 minutes, just as McCarthy had predicted, one of the main cylinders began to fail. But by then, the Pawnee was 15 miles from the nearest Japanese ships and in waters controlled by American forces. When Whitfield finally slowed completely at 8 o'clock and 17 minutes in the evening, now completely dark except for moonlight, and made the first complete count of those rescued, he discovered that they had 902 men on board, not 900, because 2 wounded soldiers whom observers on the beach had thought were dead had actually been pulled into the Pawnee by shipmates who refused to leave them behind. In Tokyo, 3 weeks later, Admiral Manase Koga, 58 years old, commander of the Japanese Combined Fleet and a veteran of 36 years of Imperial Naval Service, including graduation with honors from the Ethijima Naval Academy, read an intelligence report on the Guam incident with an expression that, and it began as professional curiosity and ended as disturbed incredulity. The report, compiled by intelligence officers based on testimony from patrol ship commanders, coastal observers, and even testimony from American prisoners captured in other operations, described in precise detail how a single American salvage tug had deliberately disobeyed orders to withdraw, entered the combat zone under intense fire, remained stationary in a vulnerable position for 8 minutes, embarked more than 900 men, and then escaped from 4 patrol ships, specifically through superior speed and unconventional evasion maneuvers. The part of the report that most disturbed Koga was the biographies section of the Pawnee's commander Marcus Whitfield, 58 years old, commercial fisherman turned naval officer, formal education ending in high school, no pre-war naval training except a 6-week merchant marine course, promoted to commander based purely on field performance rather than years of service. Koga called his chief of staff Rear Admiral Ryunosuke Kusaka, 52 years old, graduate of Etagama class of 1913 with 31 years of impeccable service, and they discussed the report for over an hour. Kusaka initially suggested the report might contain exaggerations or American propaganda, but Koga pointed out that multiple independent sources, including his own ship commanders, confirmed the essential facts. A 50-year-old fisherman had tactically outmaneuvered 4 of the Japanese patrol vessels commanded by professionally trained officers, each with at least 15 years of naval service. Most disturbingly, the fisherman had done so through decisions that directly violated both direct orders and established naval doctrine, suggesting that his lack of formal training had been an advantage, not a disadvantage, because he was not limited by conventional thinking. Koga requested similar reports from other theaters of operation and found a consistent pattern. Older American naval commanders with civilian backgrounds were consistently making unconventional tactical decisions that traditionally trained Japanese officers did not anticipate because these decisions did not follow any recognized naval doctrine. A captain who had been a carpenter was using knowledge of structural construction to predict how damaged ships would behave in different sea conditions. A commander who had been a farmer was applying agricultural resource management principles to optimize fuel consumption in ways that naval engineers had not considered. A commander who had been a teacher was organizing crews using classroom management techniques that created efficiency superior to traditional military hierarchy. Koga realized with disturbing clarity that the Americans had not simply recruited civilian amateurs out of desperation. They had accidentally created a system where diverse and unconventional life experiences became tactical assets rather than liabilities. The problem for the Japanese, Kusaka noted with obvious concern, was that there was no counter-tactic to unpredictability, grounded in decades of experience completely outside the military domain. You could train officers to anticipate conventional naval maneuvers, because they came from a finite body of tactical doctrine developed over centuries. But how did you anticipate commander using fishing techniques to navigate minefields, or using farm knowledge to manage logistics, or using construction experience to improvise repairs that engineers said were impossible? The Americans had essentially randomized aspects of their naval command in ways that made it impossible to predict behavior based on enemy training. It was an advantage that the Japanese could not replicate because their entire system was founded on rigorous standardization, uniform training beginning in adolescence, and promotion based on years of service within an established structure. You couldn't just take 50-year-old fishermen or farmers and turn them into competent naval commanders without decades of training. Except, apparently, the Americans had discovered that, yes, you could, if you selected men with life experiences that transferred naturally to naval operations and then trusted them to use their own judgment rather than rigidly following manuals. Koga wrote confidential analysis that he sent only to the Imperial Navy's most senior officers. We face not simply superior numbers or superior technology, but a fundamentally different operating philosophy that values adaptability, ability and improvisation over standardization and doctrine. It is unclear whether our tradition of excellence through rigorous training can compete against adversaries that recruit excellence from diverse life experiences and then allow that experience to flourish through decentralized command. The case of Fisherman Whitfield is not an anomaly but an example of a system that transforms apparent disadvantages into real tactical advantages. In the months following the rescue of Guam, the story of Whitfield and the Pawnee circulated throughout the U.S. Navy in ways that revealed profound differences in how Americans and Japanese thought about command and competence. For many senior American officers trained at Whitfield's action was initially problematic precisely because it violated direct orders and set a dangerous precedent where commanders could simply ignore admirals when they disagreed. A formal investigation was opened, as was necessary when any officer disobeyed direct orders, and Whitfield was called to testify before a panel of 5 senior officers at Pearl Harbor in August 1944. The transcript of this hearing, later declassified in 1973, revealed a fascinating cultural clash between traditional military mentality and civilian pragmatism. Rear Admiral Thomas Kinkaid, chairman of the panel and himself a graduate of the Annapolis class of 1908 with 36 years of impeccable service, opened the proceedings by reading the formal charges: disobedience of direct orders, reckless operation of a ship in a combat zone, unnecessary exposure of crew to danger, and violation of multiple naval regulations relating to command in a combat situation. Each accusation technically accurate, and each potentially resulting in a formal court-martial and the end of Whitfield's career. But when Kinkaid asked Whitfield to explain his actions, the old fisherman provided an answer that left the panel in an awkward silence. Whitfield said simply that he had done exactly what any competent captain would do when he saw men in danger whom he had the ability to save, Isabeth them. There was no complex tactical analysis. There was no justification based on alternative military doctrine. There was no attempt to argue regulatory technicalities. Just direct statement that for him it had obviously been the only possible choice. When Kinkaid pressed him about violating direct orders, Whitfield responded that he had understood the orders perfectly, but had made a conscious decision that preserving 900 American lives was more important than preserving his career or even preserving the chain of command intact. He did not defend this as a universal principle. He recognized that military discipline generally required strict obedience to orders, but he argued that there were exceptional situations where any man with a conscience had to choose between regulations and morality, and in these situations he would choose morality every time. What made the hearing truly remarkable was testimony from the 902 men Whitfield had rescued. The panel had planned to hear perhaps 3 or 4 representatives as character witnesses, standard procedure in military investigations. Instead, more than 400 of the rescued men volunteered at Pearl Harbor during the week of the hearing, many using their own leaves of absence, or even unauthorized absences from their units, to testify on Whitfield's behalf. The panel could not hear everyone, but allowed 12 testimonies that covered a spectrum of experiences. Sergeant James Morrison, 20th, a Marine wounded twice during the initial assault on Guam, testified that he and his companions had lost all hope of rescue when they saw other ships retreating in accordance with orders, and the pony's appearance was literally a last-chance salvation that they were sure would not come. Lieutenant Robert Chun, a 26-year-old infantry officer who had organized a perimeter defense on the beach while they awaited an impossible rescue, testified that Japanese artillery was systematically destroying their positions and that they estimated they had at most 20 more minutes before they would be completely annihilated when Pawnee appeared. Medical Corporal Thomas Washington, a 24-year-old African-American from Louisiana who had treated the wounded under sustained fire, testified through tears that he had been preparing morphine to give to men who were going to die painfully from wounds, because there was no longer any hope of evacuation, and that saving Whitfield had literally meant the difference between his having to help comrades die versus helping them survive. Each testimony was more emotional than the last, each stressing that any punishment for Whitfield would be grotesque injustice, given that he had saved 900 lives through extraordinary courage and competence. 4 days into the hearing, with more than 80 men still waiting to testify and the emotional climate becoming unsustainable, Kincaid formally suspended proceedings and called a private panel meeting. The panel's decision, announced 3 days later, was a carefully structured compromise that attempted to balance the need to maintain military discipline with recognition of extraordinary achievement. Officially, Whitfield received a formal reprimand for disobeying direct orders, a reprimand that would be placed in his permanent file and would theoretically jeopardize future promotions. In practice, the reprimand was written in such careful language as to essentially make it symbolic, and was accompanied by an official recommendation for a Silver Star for exceptional bravery in action, a recommendation that was quickly approved by the upper echelons. Most significantly, the panel issued a confidential report to the Naval High Command, arguing that the Whitfield case revealed a need to rethink doctrines about decentralized command and individual initiative in fluid combat situations. The report noted that traditional naval training emphasized obedience to orders and following established doctrine, an approach appropriate for most situations, but potentially counterproductive in scenarios where commanders on the ground have information and perspective that distant commanders cannot. It recommended developing new doctrines that explicitly allowed and even encouraged individual initiative by experienced commanders in exceptional situations, essentially codifying the kind of pragmatic judgment that Whitfield had exercised. It was a remarkable recognition that the Navy needed to learn not only from its academy-trained officers, but also from fishermen and merchant sailors who brought decades of experience making decisions under pressure in unpredictable environments. Kincaid, in a personal letter to Whitfield that was also later declassified, wrote, "Commander, Annapolis taught me a lot about being a naval officer, but you taught me something that Annapolis could not teach. That sometimes the most disciplined thing a commander can do is recognize when strict discipline must yield to higher moral imperative. The Navy needs more men who understand this." For Whitfield, official recognition was deeply ambivalent. He accepted the Silver Star at a ceremony where more than 600 of the men he had rescued attended. But in his own words, to a Stars and Stripes reporter who covered the ceremony, he said he did not feel he had done anything particularly heroic, just what obviously needed to be done. The formal reprimand bothered him not because it harmed his career, which he had never cared much about anyway, but because it suggested that it had been wrong to save 900 lives when orders said to back off. In private conversations with other merchant marine officers, Whitfield expressed frustration with military culture that sometimes seemed to value procedure over outcome, regulation over reality, hierarchy over humanity. But he also recognized, reluctantly, that military discipline often had good reasons, that decentralized commanders making independent decisions could easily result in chaos and disaster if there was no experience and judgment to inform those decisions. What made him an exceptional employee was not simply his willingness to disobey orders, but his ability to do so based on decades of experience that gave him reliable judgment about when rules could be safely broken. Not every 58-year-old fisherman could or should command a warship, but those with the right kind of experience and temperament brought perspectives that conventionally trained officers often did not. The Pawnee continued operations under Whitfield's command through the remainder of the war, participating in invasions of Iwo Jima, and Okinawa, always in a support role, but consistently executing salvage and rescue missions that saved hundreds of additional lives. Whitfield developed a reputation in the fleet as a commander who would show up when needed, regardless of danger, who would break rules when necessary, and who would always prioritize human lives over formal procedure. It was a reputation that made some senior officers uncomfortable, but made Whitfield a hero to almost everyone who actually served in combat. The broader legacy of the Guam incident was its influence on how the Navy thought about recruiting and training officers. The year following Whitfield's rescue, the Navy, formerly TI, expanded the Merchant Marine Officer Commissioning Program, specifically seeking men with decades of civilian maritime experience who could bring practical judgment and unconventional skills to naval operations. The age limit for new commissions was raised from 45 to 64 men with exceptional qualifications, recognizing that experience and maturity could more than compensate for youthful physicality in many command roles. More significantly, the Navy began to incorporate case studies like Whitfield's into officer training at Annapolis and other educational programs, using them specifically to teach the concept of disciplined initiative, where officers were encouraged to exercise independent judgment within the overall mission framework without requiring step-by-step approval from distant superiors. It was a subtle but important shift in emphasis from strict obedience to adaptive competence, a move toward a more decentralized command culture that recognized that commanders on the ground often had better information and judgment than commanders in distant headquarters. This philosophy would become increasingly important as the war progressed and operations became more dispersed and complex, requiring commanders at all levels who could make intelligent, independent decisions rather than simply executing orders mechanically. In contrast, the Imperial Japanese Navy moved in the opposite direction, responding to apparent flaws in doctrine not by embracing flexibility, but by enforcing even stricter standardization. Koga's analysis of the threat posed by unconventional American commanders was largely ignored by senior officers who interpreted setbacks not as evidence of the need to adapt operational philosophy but simply as failures of execution that could be corrected through even stricter discipline. Japanese military culture, deeply rooted in concepts of hierarchy, obedience, and conformity to established standards, had no framework for valuing the kind of improvisation and individual initiative that made commanders like Whitfield effective. Attempts to replicate apparent American advantage through modified training programs failed because they focused on teaching specific new techniques rather than developing fundamental capacity for independent judgment and creative thinking. You couldn't teach decades of diverse life experience in a few weeks program, and you couldn't create truly adaptable commanders in a system that punished deviations from standard procedure. The result was that as the war progressed and tactical situations became increasingly fluid and unpredictable, Japanese commanders often found themselves unable to adapt effectively because their training had prepared them to execute established plans, not to improvise when plans became irrelevant. In contrast, American commanders of all backgrounds, but especially those with diverse civilian backgrounds, were consistently able to adapt, improvise, and find creative solutions to new problems, not because they were inherently smarter or braver, but because their life experiences had taught them that plans always change and success requires adaptability, not conformity. 41 years later, in October 1985, a reunion of Pawnee veterans was held in San Diego, organized by some of the men rescued on Guam who had kept in touch over the decades. Whitfield, now 99 years old, with completely white hair and a bent back from almost a full century of life, most of it spent in hard physical labor, attended with his wife Martha, 96 years old, who had stood by his side through decades of absences at sea, wartime anxiety, and the tranquility of final retirement on their Napa farm that they were finally able to enjoy after the war. 342 of the 902 rescued men also attended, many now in their 60s, some with grandchildren of their own, all wanting to personally thank the man who had saved them for decades earlier. The ceremony was an emotional event that brought tears even to observers who had no personal connection to history. James Morrison, now 65, and a successful hardware store owner in Oregon, hugged Whitfield and said simply, "You gave me 40 extra years of life. I had 3 children, 7 grandchildren, built a business, saw the world at peace. None of this would have happened if you had obeyed orders that day." Robert Toon, now a professor of history at the University of California, had written a book about the Battle of Guam that devoted an entire chapter row to the rescue. A chapter he read aloud during the ceremony as Whitfield sat uncomfortably, never having really gotten used to attention or praise. Thomas Washington, who had become a doctor after the war and spent a career treating veterans in the VA system, told Whitfield that the decision to save those 900 men had resulted not just in 900 lives saved, but in thousands of lives touched and improved over the subsequent decades by all those men had done with their extended lives. Whitfield, when finally asked to speak, rose slowly, leaning on the cane he now needed, but still maintaining the dignity and presence that natural commanders never completely lose. He spoke for just 3 minutes, voice still strong despite his age, essentially saying that he didn't deserve all this recognition because he had simply done what had to be done, that any other competent and conscientious commander would have done the same, and that the true heroes were the Marines who fought on the beach and their crew who executed a flawless rescue under fire. But then he added something that revealed a lifetime's worth of perspective. I learned something that day on Guam that took decades to fully articulate. I've learned that sometimes the most important thing you can do is trust your own experience and judgment, even when all formal authority says you're wrong. I spent 30 years fishing before the war, and in those 30 years, I learned that the ocean doesn't care about your plans, doesn't respect your authority, doesn't obey your regulations. You survive in the ocean by learning to read situations, adapt quickly, and make decisions based on what is actually happening, not what manuals say should be happening. The Navy taught me a lot of things, but it couldn't teach me that, because you can't teach that in the classroom. You only learn through decades of real experience. When I saw those 900 men on the beach, I didn't consult the manual or protocols. I just knew, the way a fisherman knows when a storm is coming or when the ice is going to break, that I had to go get them. It wasn't heroism. It was simply recognizing the reality of the situation and responding appropriately. The Navy eventually understood this, and I think that was one of the things that helped us win the war. We learned to value experience and judgment over rigid conformity. We learned to trust ordinary men with unusual experiences to do extraordinary things. The Japanese never learned this, and I think this was one of their most significant disadvantages, although it is rarely discussed in history books. Whitfield's final point about the Japanese revealed something that military historians were still beginning to fully understand decades after the war, that the American advantage lay not just in resources, technology, or numbers, but in a fundamentally different operational philosophy that allowed and encouraged the kind of decentralized initiative and creative thinking that made effective commanders regardless of their formal origins. The story of the Guam rescue was a perfect example of this dynamic. Whitfield didn't win because he was better trained than Japanese commanders. He won because decades of experience as a fisherman had given him a skill set and mindset that transferred seamlessly to the challenges of naval command in fluid and unpredictable situations. His lack of formal training was not a disadvantage, but in some respects was an advantage, because he was not limited by precepts about what was or was not possible, what was or was not appropriate, that conventionally trained officers would have had. He simply saw a problem that needed to be solved and used all his skills accumulated over 5 decades at sea to solve it, without worrying whether his solution was in the manuals or not. This adaptability, repeated across thousands of similar situations at all levels of command throughout the war, gave the United States operational flexibility that more rigidly structured enemies could not match. It was not an advantage that could be easily quantified in terms of tonnage or troop numbers, but it was a real and significant advantage nonetheless. Marcus Theodore Whitfield died 9 months after the Veterans Reunion, in July 1986, at the age of 100, on his farm in Napa Valley, surrounded by family and several of the people he had rescued 42 years earlier, who had become close friends over the decades. His obituary in the New York Times, written by a correspondent who had covered the war in the Pacific, described him as exemplary of a generation of ordinary Americans who had done extraordinary things when necessary, not because they sought glory, but because they sought glory, simply because that was what the situation demanded, and they had the competence to respond. The obituary concluded with a note that summed up not just Whitfield's life, but the entire theme of older, less conventional civilian contributions to the war effort. World War II was won not just by generals and admirals, not just by young soldiers and sailors, but also by men like Marcus Whitfield, who brought decades of life experience, practical wisdom, and moral judgment to situations where these qualities were as important as formal military training. America's true strength in war lay not in having more resources than its enemies, although it did, but in having a system that could recognize and utilize talent and experience from all sources, regardless of formal credentials or age, and that trusted individuals at all levels to exercise judgment and initiative when necessary. Whitfield saved 900 lives on one day in July 1944, but he represented a principle that saved countless others. That experience, determination, and humanity matter as much as youth and formal training, and that sometimes the most important decision is to have the courage to follow your conscience even when authority tells you to do otherwise. This principle, demonstrated in thousands of situations throughout the war by thousands of unlikely people, was an essential part of the Allied victory. Yet it is an aspect of the war often overlooked in stories focused only on large-scale battles and strategies.